Hello, tank fans. This is the Totally Tanked podcast. My name is John. I'm joined in the pod with
Rob. Hello.
And we are talking on the 30th of May 2020. It has not been a good year. It doesn't seem like it's a good day on the basis of the news I'm seeing, but here we are. We're giving it a shot. We're talking about tanks so we can forget all the recent unpleasantness.
I walked up a hill this morning.
Hey, and we can talk about the unpleasantness of the past, which has happened to other people. So it's less hurtful as far as I can understand.
But what tanks?
What tank are we talking about today, Rob?
Stug 3, also known as the Sturmgeschütz Assault Gun number 3. Drei, even. What a tank.
Yes, so we didn't choose the Stug Life.
The Stug Life chose us.
That's right. Now, what a beautiful, beautiful thing. Is it a tank, though? We are talking about the tank podcast. So, let's tackle this now.
Is it a Panzer or a Sturmgeschütz assault gun?
Well, it definitely says it's an assault gun, but and it did not in fact function as an assault gun either, despite its name. I'm not by any means claiming that no Stug 3 was ever used in an assault gun role. That would be stupid. There's pretty much no role.
Do you understand what an assault gun role was?
So an assault gun is something you use going forwards.
No, that was a breakthrough tank.
Okay, the breakthrough tank is a different thing again. But the assault gun is meant to rumble up and blow up pillboxes.
Yes.
Which is why when it was first introduced, it had a low velocity...
but it did blow up pillboxes.
Yeah, low velocity, high explosive round. Now, people are down on high explosive in the anti-tank role, but you land a really big lump of high explosive on a tank, maybe you won't penetrate it, but I don't think the optics are working anymore either.
Yeah, and you've blown a track off if you're hitting it at the right spot.
So there's some merit.
There's a lot of hard bits on tanks, but there's also a lot of soft bits.
Yeah. So you might not kill the tank, but you might well mission kill it.
All right, so the Stug 3, for those people who don't know, it was a turretless assault gun.
Or casemated, you could even say.
Yes, it had a casemate, so basically, which means it doesn't have a turret, it's just got a gun sticking out the front of it.
To look back, this is why I questioned, is it a tank? Because some people, narrow-minded people, think it's only a tank if it has a rotating turret on it.
What about a reciprocating turret?
Well, that did rotate. The oscillating turret did rotate as well as oscillate. Yes, harkening back to the AMX-13. So yes, the Stug, it had a great big gun and lots of armour, and it didn't have to worry about all that complication of a turret. And as a result, it was the most successful fighting vehicle. Let's sort of cut to the spoilers. The most successful fighting vehicle that Germany produced in World War II, and the second most produced fighting vehicle.
Yes, so there
was a half track.
They built more half tracks, yes. But for the fully tracked AFV, armoured fighting vehicle, it was number one for the Nazis. With over 10,000 built, it was the most built because it was cheaper, was the big thing. It was faster to build, and it was effective for what they designed it for. And it's one of those things whereby you say, we want to have X, Y, and Z, and you know what? They actually went out and built something that did X, Y, and Z. There was no mission creep. There was there was some developmental abilities afterwards, but they had something good that worked, and then they said, what if we do this, and improved it? And they did.
Let's talk about the design heritage for a second, because basically the Panzer III was, in many ways, except for its cannon, the best armoured fighting vehicle of the start of the Second World War.
At the start of the war, yes.
And in terms of its design, I have not been inside a Panzer III, but people who know what they're talking about will tell you at significant length that the design, the layout, the ergonomics...
You can climb inside it and not lose a foot when your foot slips off the clutch.
Yeah, it was easier, and it's all very well to say, but tank crews should be tough. But fundamentally, if you can make their life easy, then they can keep doing it for longer.
And if you don't have to be between the heights of 5'6" and 5'8" to be able to fit in and drive these things, it really expands your ability to recruit when somebody can be 5'2" or 6'6" and still fit and fight in these things.
Yeah, a friend of mine who's 6'4" and was in the US Army was given a choice of cramming into a tank or jumping out of planes, and he chose to be a ranger. He's afraid of heights. He doesn't like jumping out of planes. He just likes it more than. All
right, so let's talk about the design, the history of why they built this tank. So first off, during the First World War, the Germans found that what they really needed to be able to do is bust pillboxes as they were making their advances, and then they'd come across a heavily fortified position on the Allied trench lines, and they couldn't beat it. The man-portable devices they had couldn't get through it, and the artillery, horse-drawn or tractor-drawn artillery, took too long to get up there to actually make any difference.
And the Germans were also, their artillery were masters at firing on registered targets, but they were a little slower with finding new targets.
Yeah. So, and like anything, it's just a case of you want some direct fire artillery there, and that's the idea of why the Stug was built, is saying we want some direct fire artillery in support of our infantry assaults. Now, and that's why they built it, and that's they also had the reason, some other directions as to what they wanted. Now, you were saying,
I'd say they're converging, interestingly converging things. So, firstly, they wanted a gun that they could just wheel up and blast something that was holding up the troops.
Yep.
The second thing was that the Panzer III could only mount effectively a 37mm gun, which at the start of the war was fine for knocking out. Would struggle against a Matilda, but most other tanks on the battlefield, they could either engage frontally or get around the sides and damage
them. They had
them.
good communications, they were fast enough and enough armour to get around.
But there was no growth potential in the turret ring for a bigger gun. Now, yes, they did put a 7.5mm low velocity gun in the late war, but not for a big anti-tank gun. So they had a problem that they had this great design. They were churning them out in their thousands. But it just couldn't be upgraded for where the war was going in terms of a 75mm gun being pretty much an entry point by 1943.
No.
And then some genius in the German system, and in fact it was Manstein. So yes, honest to God, genius. Said, you know what we really need isn't tanks running around with these complicated turrets. I want something with a low silhouette.
No higher than a soldier. Yeah. So, again, much lower silhouette than any turreted tank.
Yeah. And, they said, hey, if we take the chassis of the Panzer III and we don't mess around with the turret and we just mount a big sodding gun on it, immediately the first gun was another low velocity, again, 7.5mm.
It was
low velocity, stubby little gun.
It was a Sturm artillery. It was a direct fire artillery piece. But when they started mounting the 75mm gun, the long barrel, suddenly it becomes all sorts of different roles it can fulfill. Now, it's not a main battle tank. It's not a breakthrough tank. It's not designed to charge the enemy lines and take on other tanks. What it's designed for is to move in, blow things up preferably from ambush, because as we all know, ambush is murder and murder is fun.
Yeah. Now, the point is that, in our minds, tank battles are fought on empty wheat fields by, wheeling tanks, all turning their turrets.
10,000 tanks sweeping in from left and right.
They're all firing.
Smoke firing as you charge up the guts. Yeah, cannons to the left of them, cannons to the right.
But they're all firing as they move, and it's fun, and that's how we play World of Tanks and all sorts of other games. But the reality is that certainly in World War II, and even until, I would say, the 90s, although I accept that there were stabilizers earlier than that, most tanks weren't actually hitting much unless they stopped and aimed.
Yep.
And also most tanks still have to trundle down roads. Yes, they can definitely go cross country, but most of the time, most tanks
much easier to go
are trundling down a road. So,
and you've all got to cross bridges or learn how to ford a river.
Yeah, well, the Russians with their snorkels are an interesting case in point, but even then, fording a river in a T-72 is a brown trousers moment, because if the engine stops, you drown. Anyway.
They just build that into their statistics. So if 100 tanks running it and get 99 back across,
you just keep running them over the top of each other and eventually they build up a ford. Yeah. Anyway, the point is, most tanks are moving along a road. Your Stug, it is low. It is easily camouflaged. And it can register itself onto a particular bit of road and just wait until the enemy trundles across what they're aiming for. And,
yes, as I said, it wasn't your breakthrough tank. It wasn't designed to take on tanks that knew it was there. It was your secondary wave of... so when it moved into the tank destroyer role, they found these it was designed to go with infantry and move forward and support infantry as they were taking out pillboxes. But
it was an artillery corps weapon.
Correct.
They couldn't. The Grenadier Corps didn't want them. The Panzer Corps didn't want them.
The infantry didn't want them. The tanks didn't want them. So they manned them with artillerymen. So
at least they learned how to shoot.
Yeah, and knew how to actually. They could fire indirectly and provide an divisional indirect artillery role, but it wasn't their main use. Their tank basically developed into a tank destroyer role, whereby they wait in ambush for a tank to come along and they blow it up. Now that worked very well on the advance when they were doing blitzkrieg, and whereby the Panzer IVs and other blitzkrieg activities and Panzer IIIs would go forward in the early wars. Then the Stug 3s would come up as the second wave. So as they're
also very good at firing in defilade from the flanks, though, weren't they?
Yeah, well, that's the thing is you move in. Yeah, if you're on the breakthrough in the early war when the Germans were making their advances, you'd have your tanks going through to make your breakthrough, and then you move your Stug 3s up to crossroads or other strategically important areas, and you park them there, camouflage them, and when there was any sort of counterattack that come back through, suddenly you've got a tank that can knock out any sort of tank that's coming through. Bang, you've stopped whatever sort of counterattack is happening, and your breakthrough is still going forward. And that was a developed doctrine. They didn't have the doctrine for these things. They developed over time and they implemented it, and which is why it was so successful. As we said, the first doctrine was, you go forward with the infantry and you blow up pillboxes. And they realised that, hang on a sec, not only can we blow up pillboxes, we can take out any sort of... when the Germans started seeing the Russian T-34s, KV-1s and so forth, they realised that the Panzer IIIs and IVs couldn't handle it. The Panthers and the Tigers were going to take a little bit longer to get into action. So, hey, why don't we just put a better gun on, use this gun on the 7.5 centimetre long gun on the Stug 3s to take them out? And they did.
Yeah, and there's a few other advantages that were discovered of the Stug 3. Firstly, if you stop having a rotating turret, you can pile a lot of equipment on the back deck.
I looked at the profile of that tank and I thought to myself, if I was an infantryman who had to walk along beside this thing, I'd be slinging my pack on the back of there or jumping on there for a ride, because it's not like there's any turret going to spin around and knock me off or anything like that.
Yeah.
And you've got a nice big bit of armour in front of you, so any fire that might be coming down as you not having to walk along the road. And for an infantryman, not having to walk along the road is sometimes a really good thing.
Well, it keeps you fresh for when you actually need to move fast.
And the tanks needed to have infantry support. They could not be left alone. Now, we can go into more doctrine stuff if we want.
I want to tackle right now, there's an argument that happens reasonably often in these circles where you say it would be better to have lots and lots of anti-tank guns versus the cost and difficulty of building tanks. And in situations where you wargame them on, again, your hypothetical flat plane, where the tanks and the anti-tank guns have chosen to engage each other, yes, you can make a valid argument that the anti-tank guns will knock out more tanks at a more efficient cost of production. But there's a lot of problems with that.
Morale being a big one.
Morale being a big one. And for start, you've got to train the crews and you've got to then keep them alive to recoup the investment in the training. And also it's a good thing to keep your people alive in more general terms.
Yeah.
And
that was one of the aspects with the Stug 3 is that they said the infantry will feel better having a tank with them.
Yeah, something rumbling along behind.
Yeah, and they were right. It was no longer a case of we wanted a tank that could take when the Panzer IIIs and IVs couldn't take on the T-34s and KV-1s. Suddenly, they've got a tank coming along with the infantry who can win that fight, who's got the firepower to take them out, whereas the 3s and 4s couldn't. And that was a big morale bonus for, it was a decision to make that. And it was, again, Manstein has said, we need to have a tank that's going to do this, win that fight otherwise our infantry are going to not want to be there.
It also doesn't hurt to have the infantry think themselves, we're not retreating, we're not running away, we are drawing the enemy back towards our guns. So there's something to be said for that. To the point I was talking about with anti-tank guns, and definitely this filled part of the anti-tank gun role without the cost of a full tank, is it kind of filled that halfway spot between just having an anti-tank gun, and which still needs a truck to have any tactical mobility, and trucks in wartime near the front line are in desperately short supply. It doesn't matter what you're doing.
Because they can be used for anything else.
And so they will be used for everything else.
I've got to get some ammunition somewhere. Well, you can either get some ammunition somewhere or you can get the actual anti-tank gun somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, we'll get the anti-tank gun somewhere and then we'll bring up the ammunition to it. You can't do both.
Yeah. Whereas getting that package, which has always been a large part of what the tank does, isn't the particulars of the gun. It's the whole package of the crew, the ammunition, the mobility. And the Stug did all of that at a much lower cost than a traditional turreted tank.
Yes.
And with a great big...
basically, it was 20% cheaper than...
Yeah, and it only weighed 24 tons, and that was with 80 millimeters of armour.
On the front. It was only like 10 or 15 on the sides.
It did, though, have the first spaced armour.
You mean the skirts? Or?
The skirts, which basically made it look like a TIE fighter.
From the front,
From the front, because these things have quite a lot of separation.
Yeah, like about a foot separation from the tracks.
And then just a 1/4 inch of steel, just like a TIE fighter's wings down either side. Initially, very good against stopping anti-tank rifles.
Which the Russians, for their companies had started, anti-tank companies had started issuing out a lot of anti-tank rifles in order to
14 millimeters, weren't they?
Yep.
So that's significantly bigger than a 50 cal.
Yes.
Yeah. So
2 millimeters bigger. So
which in rifle terms, 2 millimeters is a lot.
Yes. And because the Russians were throwing these things out in such numbers, because they were much cheaper to build and operate than tanks, and they were still very effective against the sides of lightly armoured tanks, they said, right, we need something to stop these things. And when they started coming across bazookas and other shape-charged devices like Panzerschrecks, even though they were the ones with the Panzerschrecks.
Yeah, but also the Piats, which is one of those really underappreciated weapons of World War II.
Spring-loaded.
Well, it was spring-loaded, but it was actually an explosive spigot mortar.
The thing is, it was quiet. That was the whole point. Anyway, we can go on to that another time.
We'll have to figure out a way to talk about the Piat at some point, because it is a grossly underappreciated weapon. People made fun of it because it wasn't cool like a bazooka. But in terms of if you were hand-to-hand fighting in rubble against tanks, the Piat was the best anti-tank weapon of World War II.
Because they didn't know where you were firing from, rather than having the great big backblast danger area going off.
Just the backblast danger area. You could fire it standing with a wall behind you without incinerating yourself, which is a bit of a plus. One thing that the Germans are always criticised for is their god-awful logistics. And
only for fuel and rubber and ammunition.
Well, fuel, rubber, and ammunition, because certain people were bombing those very heavily. Rommel is rightly criticised for consuming more logistics than an army group in his failed North African campaign. But with this, because they built it on the Panzer III chassis, so the top bit in the gun, that's different. But in terms of the engine, the rolling bits, teaching people to maintain all of those things, still had the terrible transmission where they had to remove the whole casemate with a crane to drag the transmission out through the crew area, which is something the Germans just seem to like to do.
But they were built well enough that you didn't have to do that very often.
Well, yeah.
It's not like a Panther.
Yeah. Doesn't help when you build it with slave labour who are carefully cutting through the gear teeth that does it. Anyway, that's a subject for another day again. But because it was built on the common chassis of the Panzer III, which was already one of the most mass-produced fighting vehicles in world history on its own, and then they used that chassis to make the Stug 3, which was the most produced German
AFV
armoured fighting vehicle. Yeah, half-tracked.
Tracked.
Fully tracked. Let's go there. They actually solved, for once, all their logistics difficulties. Instead of having different things from Porsche and Maybach and
Mercedes and
and all these different manufacturers making their own things with their own bits and refusing to because it's one thing, everyone is critical of the Sherman, but at least there was one tank with one set of parts and it all worked, and the Stug kind of embraced that unthinkingly.
Yes.
I suspect that was a significant part of its success. Rob, what's the difference between a Stug and a Jagdpanther?
Size. The Jagdpanzer is the hunting panzer. It was designed as a tank destroyer, so it had more heavily armored.
Right. So a tank destroyer that was designed as a tank destroyer versus a tank destroyer that was designed as an assault gun.
Well, the Stug wasn't a tank destroyer. It just happened to be
really good at destroying tanks.
Just like the 88mm flat guns weren't designed to be tank killing guns. They just happened to be. They were anti-aircraft guns. They just happened to be really good at it. So it's one of those things that you know what? If we just point it downwards, it works really well.
I would still argue that the 88 was actually a very flawed anti-tank weapon. And then there's the issue that almost no one who claims to have had their tank blown up by an 88 was actually blown up by an 88. It was almost always some sort of 75. Because 88s were huge and very high, and basically all the things you don't want in a ambush weapon. Unlike the Stug. And the other thing is, you can make your crew survivable, and crew survivability should never be underestimated because it's
unless you're Russian.
Yeah. Because it's good for morale. B, it conserves expertise.
You want somebody who knows where the cup holders are to be able to jump in the next one and drive that tank.
Yeah, but as a nation, you spend an enormous amount of time and money getting people ready to operate these things, and that should never be given away lightly. And is generally given away lightly by nations on the losing side of things. And we joke about the Russians, but you actually go back and look at Russian doctrine, it was often a lot more sophisticated than it's given credit for.
I agree. It's just they basically put a price on human life and said, you know what, we're willing to accept X amount of percentage losses in order to keep everything else going and working. Yeah. And that was better than saying, no, we're going to keep 100% or we're going to go 5% or whatever else.
The other thing the Russians did, though, was, because they counted calories for the entire nation, the troops recovering from injury were the best-fed people in the Soviet Union. Not because they loved them and wanted them to be well-fed.
Militaries always do that, though. You've got training rations, you've got normal rations, and you've got recovery rations. They do look at those sort of things, and because it is a food budget that they look at spending. So training rations are high because you're doing more than you would if you're just in an operational role, because it's not as high intensity. And then when it is high intensity, you up those rations. And again, as you say, with the recovery.
But I've often, a few times seen people saying, where did all these Russians come from for the later war assaults when they lost so many early in the war? And the answer is they were fed lots and recovered and sent back to the front, where they had hopefully learned some valuable lessons.
Duck. Take out the commissars first.
Yeah.
Back to the Stug. All right. So, because they weren't tanks, they weren't panzers, and they weren't infantry, they weren't panzer grenadiers, they were artillery. But the thing was, there was no doctrine for them. So, again, they got to make up their own. And being German, they decided to make up very effective doctrine and saying what they wanted to do. So they had the design of no higher than a soldier. It was designed to take on direct fire artillery role, not to take on tanks directly.
Until they put the big 75 on.
Well, again, it's not a case of, it's not a tank used in the direct attack, in the frontal assault. There's not a breakthrough tank. But they made up their own processes. They needed infantry for protection. They were recommended to not do night or urban or heavily forested operations or security roles. So you wouldn't assign a Stug 3 to secure go along on a convoy duty with trucks bringing supplies.
40 kilometres an hour. It's not a bad speed for a tank.
But they were designed to only 40 kilometres an hour was their top speed. They're designed to do 24 kilometres an hour on road, and that was basically their operating speed. So, yes, they could have a burst of speed backwards or forwards, but it was designed to be 24 kilometres an hour.
Here's a question for you, because you've literally done military logistics. When you're trying to figure out what's going along what road at what time, how do you account for getting the slow movers to where they need to go while also getting the trucks and the things that can move at 80 kilometres or 100 kilometres an hour down that same narrow stretch of road?
With a piece of string and a map and tables. You have lots of tables that tell you
right
these things go at this speed, therefore they make if it's going over this distance, it'll take that long to get there. And you get your piece of string and you mark it out on your map to figure out the route of the on the map, and you figure out, okay, that is 12 kilometers, and therefore it'll take this slot 2 hours to get there. It'll take this slot 4 hours to get there. It'll take this what, and then you work all that. I
just want to note for the listeners that Rob is making hand gestures of various lengths of bits of string that I feel is an important.
It's usually red string is stands out, but no, right. No. But seriously, that was nowadays there is a lot more computer technology to be able to do that for you. And what I learned, it was probably based exactly straight on what they were doing back then. Because you just have tables, and that's what computers are all about. Tables and putting it all together and figuring it out. And that's where these sort of things come from.
I mean, one of the underappreciated things about the Ghost Division and the fall of France is that the reason why the Panzer commanders felt the need to advance...
Is that Gaunt's Ghost?
Sorry? No. Felt the need to go as quickly as they did was because they were told that if they were less than 20 kilometres in front of the infantry, then they had to fall under the command of the infantry divisional commanders so that they weren't messing up logistics. So if they wanted to keep operating freely, they had to stay out of the way, and that meant staying out in front. And that's why there was all this weirdness with, Guderian getting arrested. And it's fascinating how chaotic the Germans were as they rampaged across France. But in that chaos, the French certainly had no idea what was about to happen to them next.
Again, all that sort of stuff helped develop the doctrine that they actually employed through the rest of the war. And you're right, there was a period of time of chaos where they can... throw it in and see what happens, and suddenly, you know what, Blitzkrieg worked. But that was pretty much the last time they really used that effectively. But they developed doctrine that helped support all their other activities. So the German General Staff took all that information and did what they do best, is analysed it and said, this will do this and that will do that. And this is how we make the two of them work together in order to create synergies.
Yeah, I mean, there's an underappreciated and... I'll confess it's much studied for all it's underappreciated, that there is a certain rigidity to German doctrine, but their army certainly was actually very good at being insanely flexible. To the point that a sergeant with a mission might end up commanding colonels and majors to give him resources to complete the mission. That was an unusual case, but it definitely did happen.
You have doctrine in order to achieve your stated goals. You then develop improvise beyond that.
Yeah, you do then get a point though where yes, the Germans put their smartest people into these frontline military fighting roles, which the Allies would not put someone who they had identified as being that smart in those roles. Those people were designing tanks or doing cryptography, which gave the Germans a slight advantage in the tactics on the battlefield and lost them the war strategically in the long run.
I think lack of resources probably...
Yeah. There were a lot of things, but a significant part of it was that they were putting very smart people in the front lines where... Certainly the way the Americans were screening for IQ, the infantry were not the smart guys. It's controversial, not meant as a slight, but they were literally putting them through IQ tests, and the smart ones were not being put into frontline infantry roles.
No.
Where, intelligence as measured by IQ is a horrifically fraught subject as well. But as far as they knew from the testing that they were doing, that was a choice they were making.
So going back to the doctrine for the Stug 3, so you had So you had they were limited divisional artillery. So if they were attached to a division, they could provide indirect fire out to 6 kilometres. But by the stage of the war, their main role was to be providing tank destroyer activities up to 500 metres. They worked in independent battalion commands and were attached to whatever formation as required. So they weren't penny packeted out to a either infantry or panzers or whatever else. It's a case of they're not embedded. It was a case of this operation is going to be performed by infantry, this one's going to be performed by tanks, and we'll add in Stug 3s as required, rather than when the infantry goes forward, they take all their Stug 3s with them. No, it was a case of, you add them in when they're required. So they were independent commands.
But, okay, how did they make that work for them? Because famously, the American tank destroyers, which was an independent arm, which was a huge deal. Like, there was armour, artillery, infantry, and tank destroyers in the US Army. And they never got the tank destroyers in the right place at the right time to be tank destroyers. Well, not never, but it was a notable failure.
Whereas why the British Fireflies were so effective, because they were embedded in
one Firefly per platoon. Yeah,
they were embedded in their tank platoons, whereas the Americans weren't. They were left them at home because I'd rather have more Shermans in the front than have the bigger guns in there.
Yeah, so it's
the M10s.
I guess what I'm saying is it's easy to write in your doctrine document, we will deploy these as needed. But in this case, the Germans actually did get them where they needed to go. Is that just because they were on the retreat? So
well, that, and one, they didn't have to come across the channel. Was probably the big thing, is that they already had them there. So you've got resources there saying, okay, I've got these limited resources available to me. I can put them in, or I can save them for... or somebody else can use them, and that is a decision you're making, rather than with the Americans. It was a case of I can put 20 Shermans on board this ship to land it in Normandy, or I can put 10 M10 tank destroyers. I'll take the 20 Shermans, thanks, and keep them moving forward, because they are their own command. Whereas you don't, if you've got your own command, you basically wait till everything's in it there before you send it forward. Whereas because the Stugs were in a much smaller command group of battalion size, it was much easier to say, yep, there is a battalion of 13 Stugs, 7? No, I can't remember.
It's worth noting the Stug battalions were often designated as brigades by the Germans, and that was done purely as misinformation.
Yes.
So if you're reading any sort of record of things and you see a reference to a Stug brigade, chances are it was actually only battalion strength. There is also an issue that the Stug's gun was, for all that it was chosen for its tank killing abilities, they could and did carry a wide variety of ammunition. It wasn't just an anti-tank range.
No, it was HE. There was smoke, which was really good for running away
and setting fire to houses. Apparently,
smoke.
Yeah, it was in the manuals that if you want to set fire to a house, a smoke round was much better than
HE round.
Yeah, well, HE would sort of blow the house up, whereas a smoke round would set fire to it, as well as generating a lot of smoke.
There you go. Okay.
Pyromaniacs in war. Fire is always an important weapon.
God, yeah. And so it's smoke. Being able to either designate where to shoot or hide behind.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to pause for a moment and come back with a
beer review. Okay, so we are back for the beer review portion of the podcast.
Because what's a podcast without a beer review? Tonight,
certainly a podcast.
This afternoon, sorry, it's getting dark. It's not quite dark yet, but it's not still afternoon. Today's beer is White Rabbit Dark Ale. White Rabbit.
Now, White Rabbit
99% sugar free.
It's 1% sugar. Yeah, that's also that's basically a lie, because what they mean is it doesn't have sucrose, the sugar in there, but I guarantee you that the dark maltodextrins that give it the glorious
Darkness.
Brown. It's a dark brown ale. It's not quite as black as a stout, but it's...
You're right. I didn't notice that. Yeah, when I hold it up to the light, it is definitely dark brown.
It's dark brown. It's not as impenetrable and difficult to get at as a stout. Like, if you're not used to drinking but dark beers, it's a really good introduction to dark beers. The White Rabbit Brewery was an independent Australian brewery based out of Hillsville in Victoria. They often had a problem that their white ale was the thing they were best known for, and if you had it fresh, it was one of the most amazing beers you could ever have. Because I used to work in the brewing industry at a few festivals I went to, the White Rabbit guys would come by and be like, "Oh, you guys are White Rabbit, I know your stuff." And they're like, "This is fresh. You don't know anything about our beer until you try this." And I'll be like, "You are correct. This is amazing." But all those juniper berry flavours and things like that just disappear in quite quickly over time. So most people never had that. It was since bought by Lion, which is basically the Japanese Kirin company.
One of the big breweries.
Yeah, but they keep this Australian entity called Lion to try and make it seem like they're Australian and not Japanese. But it's fundamentally a Japanese company, which in beer terms is no bad thing. Japanese make amazingly good beer.
I love Japanese beer.
Anyway, they still make beer to a very good quality, and anyone who's... Hello, Ian. That's Ian the Kelpie. She's making herself known to us. Anyone who's thinking about trying dark beer but doesn't really like dark beer yet, this is this bridge. This is the bridge that will get you to the dark beers. And as such, thank you very much for bringing it around, Rob.
That's quite all right. I was looking at a Cooper's... dark best extra stout, but decided to go with this one instead because I'm pretty sure we've done that one before and I couldn't remember.
Oh, at some point we might have, but this is a.
I do like my stouts for the colder months of Canberra.
Wow, so. Your palate's matured from the the old days.
Tooheys Red was all I used to drink. Yeah, it was some. 27 years ago?
Yeah, something like that. We could grow
29 years ago? Something like that, yeah. No, I do change my drinking flavours for the various months.
Anyway, what are you going to give this one?
Oh, look, it's a 1 point... it's only a... It's 1.3 standard drink, so it's only a 4.9... alcohol per volume, so but it's very tasty, as you said. It's sits very nicely. It's what's embossed on the bottle here? Is that a Little Creatures or is it something?
That does in fact look like they've used the Little Creatures bottle to because it's the same parent company. I think that's definitely a stuff up in the in the bottling plant.
It's actually written down the bottom, Little Creatures. Brewing. There you go.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, it's a little sad because when they bought the White Rabbit Brewery, they promised that they wouldn't abandon the town of Hillsville that the brewery had come up in. But then when they did an audit and they looked at the numbers and looked at the capacity of the Hillsville plant, they just said, "Nah." Closed it all down. Kept the brand.
I think there's a Russell Crowe, Anthony Hopkins movie about that.
Yeah, they should make one.
Well, no, I think they did, except it was about Ugg boots. But
yes. All right, let's get back to tanks. There's still so much we haven't talked about the Stug 3 because we keep getting distracted. Well, I keep getting distracted.
We both get distracted because we like to talk about stuff while drinking beer.
We're talking about related stuff. I think that's okay. So, Rob, what else do we need to talk about?
All right, the extent to which the Stug 3 was used. So, yes, it was built by the Nazis, but they weren't the only ones to use it. They gave it to some of their Finnish friends for when the Finns had to took on the Russians during 39-40.
They weren't using Stugs for that.
Yeah?
No, that was the continuation war of the Stugs. Which is the later one.
Oh, okay. Some point in time, the Finns had various Stugs.
Yeah, the Stugs didn't start in service till 1940.
Okay,
this is kind of my point.
Yep. No, great. Good point. Well made. The Hungarians, the Romanians, and various other client states of the Nazis were given Stugs to fight various rations.
Germans, the Germans always stuck, not always, but generally stuck with the flawed 5-person crew. Let's just say 5-man, because they were mostly men. Whereas the 4-person crew was, up until the invention of the autoloader, kind of the gold standard for tank crewing. Whereas the Stug, they stripped it back. They said, we don't need a alternate driver or a bow gunner, or
because you don't have all that, and you. They probably actually had more room inside the casemate than turrets.
Yeah. Well, they don't have to worry about basketing or the turret turning around and ripping off anyone's foot. It's it would have been delightful compared to a Panzer III, particularly once you take one dude out of it. You got that lovely deck for sleeping on. It's all golden.
Now, what was interesting was that your driver, your gunner, and your commander were all in a line on the left-hand side. Well, if you were looking at it from the front, the right-hand side of the tank.
And down one side.
On one side. So one shot through the middle would all that. But
it's got to get through 80 millimeters of armor.
Yeah, exactly. But and only the loader on the left-hand side of the tank. So, which was again a bit of a differing design, where usually you'd have 2 and 2 type thing. And they said no, we don't need any of that sort of stuff.
I can definitely see the advantage, particularly for a gun that doesn't traverse, of having the tank commander and the gunner on the same side. And it makes complete sense to put the loader on the opposite side, as long as you can make the gun so that the breech is on that side. And throughout history, there have been reasons why you can't do that, but in this case, they could. So,
and that was very good for the gunner, because one of the innovations for the Stug 3 was the periscope for the gunner. So their gun sights were 2 feet. Because it didn't have a turret, they didn't have a very high visibility. And so if the gunner was to be looking along directly out from what the gun would be seeing,
they'd a direct fire weapon. So
they'd only be seeing the foliage or whatever was being used to camouflage the tank. So rather than looking directly along the barrel, the gunner had a periscope optics that would allow them to see from the top of the casemate, meaning that they got better visibility, and without the exposure of having a turret, they could see from 2 feet above their head what was around them, and that provided much better ambush ability, because they could have low cover and with just the barrel sticking up. Did have the issue of making sure there wasn't a low wall or a berm or some sort of other obstacle right in front of the barrel. But the thing is, even the tank commander was also looking from the same point. He was looking at
he had his scissor sights.
Yeah, he would be looking for even higher up. But they weren't looking along the barrel. So you had 2 options here. One, you could ask the driver, who was right in front of the gunner, so the gunner could give him a good kick and say, is there a berm or a tree or a low wall right in front of the barrel? Or you can get the loader to stick his head in the breech and say, look along the
the muzzle, the bore,
straight along the bore, and say, nope, all clear, load it up, ready, aim, fire. Away you go. So it was an innovation and made it such a good ambush tank, and that they didn't have that high profile turret. They could sit there in a concealed position and bang, away you go. Loader, gunner, go. Loader, gunner, go. And then when they want to run away, reverse back. So they only had 12 degrees of movement on the barrel without moving the tank. So 12 degrees on either side. So 24 degrees all up. 12 degrees left, 12 degrees right.
For a weapon that's designed to be used at ranges of 1 kilometre.
500 metres.
Okay, but
it was designed to take on tanks at 500 metres.
I've seen reference in their manuals that it was definitely like no more than.
They don't want, meters. They don't. Anything inside of 1,000 meters is a good target, but anything close to them is bad juju.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that armchair generals and ourselves, you're often like, oh, why don't you kill things at 5 kilometers, or naval guns are firing 25 kilometers, and it's like measure out the distance, or let's even talk in terms of miles for our American audience. We're talking 2/3 of a mile is a kilometer, more or less. I've actually measured it out on the nearby street. If I go to the
kilometre, I've watched the video, John.
Yeah, if I go to the nearest set of lights, traffic lights, and look down the road, it is all the way to the next major road, and at a distance you can just about see cars moving in the other traffic lights. With the unaided eye, you cannot see a whole lot, and particularly
that's what optics are for.
Yeah, but with a forest, you've got to know there's something to look through the optic to see, though. Because in general terms, if
which
something...
is why you set up an ambush, so you can see the point you want to be shooting at.
You're looking right down that road, and you know exactly where you're
or that crossroads is what you want to be looking
crossroads in particular. Yeah, get them both ways. And they all have to come there.
They all have to go there. That's the point of setting an ambush.
Yeah. My point is that yes, Germans had good optics, but the optics weren't always clean. They were covered in diesel smoke, and it was foggy, and there was rain, and
which is why they didn't fight at night in these things.
Yeah.
Or short distances. Yeah. Short distances are bad. Driving this tank in World of Tanks, when you have the light tanks doing circle strafing around you, is going, why don't I have a turret that I can shoot these guys with? No, it's a case of it's one of those things.
Hey, okay.
But at distance...
I'm going to ask you a question.
Yeah.
And this is unrelated-ish to tanks, but it's kind of World of Tanks related. I was playing World of Warships last night, and I peeled off from the ships that I'd been started with to go to the other side of the map to join up with the larger force.
Did you leave your wingman, did you?
Well, there were two of them. And this dude took the effort to find out my account and send me a message calling me a coward. Believe me, this thing flashed up. Yeah, this guy's created a group and he's put you in it, and he's calling you a cat.
Yep. That's because people suck.
Okay, I mean, I reported him to Sony, but
see, my usual response when playing these games, because I'm usually playing them late at night, and I might have had a beer or two beforehand, is to say, I'm drunk. What's your excuse, idiot? Yeah. Or just laugh at them and go, lol.
Yeah. No, but this was outside of the game. This was in the message center. Anyway,
that's what they do because people suck.
Yeah, I was like, I'm allowed to play the game how I want. I don't have to hang out with you loser. Turned out he was the absolute best player on the map as well, but that's unrelated. I had a decent game. I was middling. Okay, getting back to the Stug.
John, that's just people. You just got to go, lol.
Yeah. That guy's an asshole. Okay. Use a Russian bear. Keep an eye out for him. Report him. Okay, getting back to Stugs and World War II. Well, not just World War II. They did fight in the Six-Day War.
As their last hurrah, yes. As they got blown up by the Israelis.
It didn't go well.
No. The Israelis did not think much of the Stug 3 as they took them on with their chieftains and AMXs.
Yeah, the Syrians...
So the Syrians got a bunch of them from the Russians after the war.
Jeez, that's a job lot of doom, isn't it? Well, do they even bother to hose the bodies out before they handed them over to them?
There were plenty that the Russians captured that weren't battle damaged. There was a case of, you've surrendered and we're taking your tanks.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Yeah, no, the Russians had plenty to muck around with.
I was going to say...
give out to neighbour states. Or
come the end of World War II,
client states.
Even the Russians would have had so many tanks. They're looking at going, what do we do with this?
And so they gave them out to the Syrians because they obviously didn't want to... they wanted to make a client state with a warm water port and that they could deal with.
I've got to say that the Stug seems like, if I'm in Northern Europe, not a bad vehicle to go to war with. If I'm hooning around the Middle East, I don't want to be
if I can sit on top of the Golan Heights with a Stug 3 as a pillbox, I'm not actually too unhappy about that idea.
That's not too bad, but in terms of being buttoned up for ambush...
no, I wouldn't want to be driving around. Yeah. I wouldn't want to be driving around, but I could quite happily sit on top of the Golan Heights with a Stug 3.
You'd want all your hatches open, is kind of where I'm going.
And air superiority is what you want.
Yeah, well, that's always the dream, isn't it?
Yeah, so they didn't have... So it did get deployed in a number of other places. So the Swedes had some, as I said, the Bulgarians, the Hungarians, the Czechs, the Yugoslavs had some all after the war. The French even had some after the war they mucked around with, but didn't have, obviously, because the Germans lost, they didn't have a production line after the war. It's just a case of, what have we got left over? Yeah, that'll do. We'll throw these out and give it out to whoever wants to use them at this point in time. But yeah, up to 67. So 6-Day War in 67 as their last hurrah. And yes, they got blown up a lot at that point in time.
Yeah.
Probably mainly by air power. Because why wouldn't you? Other things. Things we haven't talked about is the Zimmerit.
Yes, which, if you've looked at a picture of a German tank, particularly a late war one after 43, they often have this weird crosshatch pattern.
Which is good for anti-slip type thing. But
although it's easy to do it. You can do anti-slip by putting some sand on something and putting some paint over the top. Or wet paint and then the sand on top. That works too. But instead, Zimmerit was produced and created this weird crosshatch pattern. Created an enormous fire hazard. It was very easy to set on fire a tank with Zimmerit on it because the structure was actually made.
But what was the Zimmerit for, John?
The Zimmerit was to stop magnetic mines being attached.
And who had magnetic mines?
The Germans had magnetic mines.
Wow. So everybody else must have had them as well.
Well, that was what they were worried about, yes.
Did they?
No.
Oh!
No one else had magnetic mines. They went to all this trouble of making their tanks much more likely to catch on fire at great expense, added a bit of weight. I'm not saying, the Zimmerit was what broke the Panzer IV's weight limits, but it didn't help.
Now, the other thing I liked when they added to the Stug 3 was the cement, right? When they said, you know what, this tank really needs a bit of extra protection. We're short on steel, and steel can't really be shaped into the shape we want it to. So, you know what? I'm going to get a mould. I'm going to pour some wet cement into it, and bang, there you go. Some extra protection from the front of my tank that is a good little pillbox.
See, I reckon you're actually on the path to Dorchester laminate with something like that. Because you put your concrete on your steel. Then any sort of penetrator that's trying to get through that is having to transition from one medium to another.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what, I'm sorry, when I say Dorchester, people who follow...
Chobham.
Yeah, Chobham is what it's more well known as, but Chobham is like the 1990s version, and I believe it's Dorchester's the most recent one. It's the reason why British tanks haven't been penetrated in the last 40 years. Is that they've got this mixture of ceramics and heavy metals and just steel. And in a way, sticking concrete on top of your steel is the start of the path onto that superior armour, where you're just trying to defeat the physics of a penetrator that is being designed to just cut through rolled homogeneous steel.
Now, look, it's one of those things that...
Same reason you tie logs to the side of your tank. I mean, A, you need those logs for your camping.
Or recovery from a bog.
Yeah, but B, they will also detonate a penetrator or disrupt a penetrator before it touches your actual armour.
Unlike the sandbags that the Shermans would throw on top of them and would cause them to overheat and stop.
Yeah, Patton hated all of that armour because it slowed his tanks down, but the tankers actually really liked not dying.
Soft. All right, other things. I'm not sure what else we've got to cover, John. We've got the 4 crew people. We've got Sturmgeschütz, as I said, is the name of how you pronounce the full proper title of Sturmgeschütz 3.
We did mention that the Finns used them. We didn't mention that the Finns achieved a kill ratio with them that exceeded anything the Germans did.
Well, they're the Finns, though.
It's
just where we're going to put all the bodies, remember?
Yeah, so the Finns were tough and the Finns used their gear very well. When you talk about the Finns, the Australians always bang on about how the Brewster Buffalo was a terrible fighter and the British were bad people for making Australian pilots use Brewsters against the Japanese. Brewster Buffalo actually had the best kill ratio of the war when the Finns used them against the Soviets. But Just makes you think Australian pilots weren't very well trained.
Or there's particular targets that a lot more space that they had to be patrolling and disperse formations rather than...
You've got to remember, Australian pilots also said the Spitfire was no good. So, it starts to be a common denominator. But let's move on from that. Back to the Stug on the ground.
Now... One of my fun things is always maintenance. We talked about it before, about the transmission, but also repairing the engine. 4 to 5 days. So it had a 155-kilometre range. So tank of petrol would get 155 kilometres.
Which is not a long way.
No, but in Europe, not in Australia, but in Europe, it's not bad, especially when
out on the Eastern Front.
Especially when you're whacking them on if you want to actually get them anywhere, you put them on a train and away you go. But every 4 to 5 days, they had to come back for maintenance. Now, that wasn't actually a bad ratio for these sort of tanks. A lot of tanks only had a 2-day ratio. Basically, it could be in operations and like fighting operations before they had to be rotated out. So 4 to 5 days is not a bad option for the Stug. So it just showed their reliability, and they had the turnaround, so they could be maintained within a day, and then back out the next day. So you get your crews get a 1-day break as the maintenance happens, and then they're back on the line.
It does make you think about the logistics, though, that given that they can only move 40 kilometres an hour and they can only go 150 kilometres on a tank of fuel. They were petrol-driven, gasoline-driven. That means you need a very intensive maintenance depot very close to the front line to even think about using them.
But that was what you needed for any tank battalion. So
yeah,
these were not tanks that were driving 1,000 kilometres like your Abrams or your Leopards or anything like that. It's a case of, no, they're fighting one town to the next town to the next town to the next town.
Which comes back to the old thing about the distance from the railheads to the front was actually off, and the trains were often the determining factor of how these things went. That's why Kharkov was such a legendary battleground, because it was such an important rail nexus. Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else you want to say about the Stug, Rob? Because we're coming up on an hour, so I think we've treated the audience to enough of our...
ramblings?
Armoured warfare-related ramblings, yes.
Look, as I said, it's manned by artillery to begin with. It had developed its own doctrine. It was not a tank. It was not a tank destroyer.
Well, no, it is a tank because it is a tracked fighting vehicle.
But it wasn't part of the Panzer formations, right? It was its own independent command.
This is a tank podcast. We're talking about it. It's
direct fire. But what I'm saying, it deserves its place.
We're getting my Bren gun carriers in now, though. We've opened the path.
Technicals.
No tracks.
Oh, Bren gun carriers could be cool, actually. Yeah. Right. So, well, look, it did a lot of things well, and importantly, I like that they set out the design and they built it to that, and it actually worked. And it had a lot of benefits from, as you said, the logistics train and the training and the commonality of parts and all those sort of things. It was a good tank, and they were used.
But they learned nothing from it.
And they used it
effectively. Oh wow,
this
has made everything so much easier. They said, "Oh no, let's build weird tanks here and weird tanks there,
mouses and elephants and
things that can't cross any bridge in Europe." Totally ignoring the success of what they've done by taking.
That's a really good point. Yeah, this is the failure of the Germans' high commanders saying, "Yep, here is something that's really successful. We'll just ignore all the lessons learnt." Yeah. There should have been a review of that and said, okay, let's figure it out from there. All right. Anything further we want to say about the Sturmgeschütz 3 assault gun?
Assault gun. No, I think we're done.
All right. Thank you all for listening to our ramblings.
Thank you, folks. It's been good.
Yes. Take care.
We will be back.
Survive the virus, and we'll see what the next apocalypse is going to bring us.
Yeah, but until then, we plan to be back next month, so we won't leave you waiting quite as long. Okay, good night.
Good night.